No matter the sport, these two got you covered. Spanning the globe, it's Gunther and Ben, presented by the sports training experts at Intermountain Sports Medicine, Tosh, the orthopedic specialty hospital, on Utah's #1 sports talk, ESPN 700.
Gunther and Ben, ESPN 700, 202. Kyle Gunther, Ben Anderson. Happy Tuesday.
Well, there's a number of things that you can call us. You can call the show Gunther and Ben. He's Ben Anderson. I'm Kyle Gunther, but you can't call Jimmy Butler James today.
His name's Jimmy.
Well, he says that his name is Jimmy. His coach tried to give him the moniker of James Butler after his performance last night in Game 2 to tie up that series with Philly and Toronto. But he says, don't call me James.
Let's keep talking the NBA playoffs, the NBA draft a little bit, in the Utah Jazz summer. Our next guest, you can find him on Twitter at Reed Forgrave. You can read him at CBSSports.com. It is Reed Forgrave. Reed, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Reed.
I think Jimmy has called people much worse names than that before, so I don't feel all that bad for him.
Only all of his coaches that he's ever had has he called worse names.
Man, that would be not a fun job sometimes.
Let's start there.
Talented player.
Let's start with Philly and what they did last night. I mean, I know you probably got to win a series, but are they on the right track to potentially keeping Jimmy Butler and Tobias Harris this offseason?
I mean, I think you got to win the series, right? And the other thing is you got to figure out if you want to give up 2 max or close to max contracts for Jimmy Butler, a player who's not getting any younger, and Tobias Harris, a guy who's, I think, awesome and like one of the most perennially underrated players in the NBA, and I think fits in perfectly. But there's going to be other offers for him. So my guess is that they end up settling for one of those guys, not both of them. And my guess is they'll probably pick Tobias. But who knows, man? Like, there's going to be – I do think this, as much as we think, Kawhi's going to the Clippers and Kyrie and KD are going to the Knicks, like, we are almost certainly in line for some big-time surprises this offseason.
Well, along those lines, then, how likely would it be for Kyrie Irving to rejoin LeBron in L.A., then, in your opinion?
That feels so fanciful, right? That feels so ridiculous. Like it would be like not just breaking up with the girl, but like straight up divorcing your wife, and then 3 years later being like, so being single's harder than I thought. Let's get back together. It feels extremely fanciful, right? It wasn't. I mean, what Kyrie did to LeBron. I mean, whatever. Maybe LeBron deserved it, but Kyrie really put a crimp in his legacy. Like, Kyrie leaving that Cavs team meant LeBron didn't have a legit shot at another title. It put him in a bad spot. So I'm sure LeBron, after this year with the Lakers, would gladly welcome him back with open arms. But it just doesn't feel like something is particularly realistic there. To me, the idea of Kyrie and KD going to the Knicks, I mean, there's just so much smoke you have to assume that there's fire. That would be my guess as the most likely destination, and then next most likely would be staying in Boston. But, man, the idea of Kyrie and LeBron together again after all these years would be – I mean, it would be fascinating. It would be a hell of a story, right? I'd be excited to write about it, that's for sure.
Reed, it's strange that it seems like the pool for free agents are all still healthy and playing right now in the NBA second round. You look at Golden State, has obviously Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson. Kawhi still playing in Toronto. As you mentioned, Kyrie's still playing in Boston. There's a bunch of names that are maybe looking elsewhere. We talked about Philly already, and it's 9 of the 10 best free agents coming up this offseason that are going to be available. Does playoff success dictate where they go, or do you think it's just going to be chaos come July 1st?
Yeah, I mean, it's everybody but Kemba, right? I think playoff success matters, especially in the East, because I feel in the East, 2 of these 4 teams are going to lose in the second round, and that's going to be crushing. And if you're the Sixers and let's look at the Raptors. If you're the Raptors and you lose in the second round, I don't think your chance of getting Kawhi to stay is that great anyway. It sounds like the dude's, he wants to go back to SoCal. I don't blame him. Like, SoCal's awesome, especially when you're like
making $200 million over 4 years. But if they don't make the conference finals, at least you have to assume that that is a foregone conclusion. If they make the finals, if they push I assume the Warriors are going to be the team that comes out of the West. If they push the Warriors or whatever team comes out of the West to 6 or 7 games, maybe even win it, it makes it a lot harder for Kawhi to say no. But yeah, I mean, NBA players, they want to win, and they want proof that they can win. And when you're up and going to a different franchise, you're taking a risk. You're going for the unknown instead of the known. So I think the next month and a half will have huge impact on what will happen in July.
Will Game 2 tonight between Houston and Golden State be officiated any differently because of the drama that Houston has created about these calls or non-calls?
I would imagine yes. It wasn't that those were really, especially in the first half, it wasn't that those were just judgment calls that they could have gone either way. They were missed calls, the ones especially on Klay sliding under the shooter, sliding under James Harden. Those have been called all year long, and it was bizarre to me they weren't called in that game. I generally think NBA refs do an incredible job. I think it is the hardest sport to referee out of all the sports because there's just so much nuance and there's so much happening so quickly with all these bodies running every which way. I think being an NBA referee is an incredibly hard job, and they generally do an incredible job. They did not do an incredible job in Game 1 there. I thought it was poorly refereed on both sides. I mean, that fourth quarter felt like one big makeup call, but I don't think an unbiased observer can come out of that game thinking anything other than it was the Rockets who were hurt more from that than the Warriors. I think it's also there's more to it, that discussion than that, because James Harden has a significant portion of his greatness is gaming the system. He has sort of hacked the system. He knows how to act to make it seem like there's a foul when there isn't one, and he knows how to get a foul. That is why he won the MVP award last year. It's a huge part of his game. He's led the league in free throws attempted, I think, 3 of the past 5 years. So for them to call so much attention to that, I didn't like what they did releasing that memo that they didn't send to the NBA about Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals last year. I thought that was kind of a cheap, weird move. But it gets the conversation going, and I would imagine they get a much friendlier whistle in this game.
Reed Forgray's our guest, ESPN 700. Boston, out of nowhere, has won 5 straight playoff games. They were very impressive in their first game win, I should say, against Milwaukee. They dominated that game in the first quarter and the third quarter, and then were able to hang on and continue to build on that lead. Do you believe this just meshed perfectly for them and that they've come together at the right time? And does that change what they do this offseason?
On paper, this series should have been a blowout. It should have been the Bucks in 5. That's what I predicted. All season long, these two teams have shown us who they are, and the Bucks are a juggernaut, whereas the Celtics are at times great, at times awful. They're just kind of dysfunctional, and yet we always knew that there was the possibility. I didn't believe in that possibility. There's just so much evidence to the contrary that the Celtics weren't going to be great in the playoffs. But we always knew there was a possibility that they could. I think what this series is going to come down to is, are the Bucks a playoff team? Is Mike Budenholzer a playoff coach? Is his system something that can work in the playoffs? And if it isn't, can he make the necessary adjustments? I'm a little worried that he's going to stay too married to it. And maybe he should, right? Like, they were awesome all year long. Giannis is a complete freak of nature. They have the perfect system around Giannis. They're missing, one of their best complementary players in Malcolm Brogdon. In theory, he could be back for Game 3. But if you're down 2-0, I don't like your chances whether you get Malcolm Brogdon or Michael Jordan coming off the injury list. So it's not a must-win. It's only Game 2, but it's as close to a must-win as you can get for the Bucks. And I do think they're going to have to make some pretty significant adjustments, namely like trying to figure out when the Celtics kind of wall off Giannis in transition, trying to figure out a way out of it. Giannis was stifled in a way that he probably hasn't been all season. And then Celtics, just that pick and pop worked so incredibly well. These were things that if you're Mike Budenholzer and you're the Bucks, you had a week to prepare for this. You should have expected these things. So we'll see. My guess is they're kind of married to the way that they play. And much like the Rockets last year, they're going to play the way they play. And if they end up shooting 0 for 27 from 3 in Game 7, like the Rockets did a year ago, they're going to go out swinging their way. And I think that could be a mistake. I'm not sure what the adjustments need to be exactly. But after watching Game 1, that wasn't just one of those like, hey, one team made more shots and things will normalize in Game 2. That was like one team got significantly outclassed. You got to imagine the Bucks come out with so much energy at home in Game 2 that this conversation feels silly 24 hours from now. But I don't know. That Game 1 was the Bucks' worst loss of the season.
Well, it was a tough loss in Game 1 last night for Portland. They just looked out of sync on offense, almost as if Denver was playing them differently defensively. And, even though at the end of the night, Damian Lillard had a good night offensively, there was just no way to stop the freight train that was Nikola Jokic, who's got this weird ability to create shots with his size, and he's hitting all of his free throws there. Is there a way that Portland can adjust here now? I mean, Enes Kanter looked, I guess, somewhat healthy last night. Is there an adjustment they can make to try to slow down Jokic?
Yeah, one, Enes Kanter, don't dunk and then hang on the rim with your shoulder that was recently separated.
Yeah.
Not smart, but he was great, man. Like, I thought that trade was perplexing at the time, and then with Yusuf Nurkic down, Enes Kanter is probably the key in this series. I'm not sure if the Blazers have a way to stop Jokic, but I think you really hit it on its head. Like, the Blazers were out of sync in that game. Game talked about it afterwards. We were spending too much time talking to the refs and not enough time talking to each other. It just wasn't good communication. They look like a road team who was a little bit overwhelmed by being the road team in a really, really loud arena. I think this series is too close to call. I think talent-wise, both of these teams are awesome. I would give the edge to Denver just because, not just because they won Game 1, because they have home court, and home court advantage for both these teams is a really, really big deal. But from a basketball sense, it kind of comes down to, can some combination of Enes Kanter, Myers Leonard, and Zach Collins stop Jokic or keep him in check? Good luck, man. Like, Nikola Jokic is like, if I were 7 feet tall and talented at basketball, I feel like I'd be kind of like Nikola Jokic, but I'm neither of those things. He just doesn't look like a basketball player, but what he does is so unique. He's like no player in the NBA, and I think that makes him so hard to defend because you're not used to defending guys like that, and it's not like you have an elite big man defender in any of those three guys to do it. So this is going to be an uphill battle for the Blazers for sure.
Reed Forgrave's our guest, ESPN 700. The Jazz bet on internal improvement this year. Yeah, they went out and added an aging Kyle Korver, but his body started to break down towards the end of the year. And they won 2 more games in the regular season, and then they got bounced a round earlier than they have each of the previous 2 years. What do you make of the Jazz season? Do they have any momentum going into the offseason where they could have as much as $30 million to play with?
Can I call it like a successful failure? Because you wanted to have more from this season than you did. You didn't want to lose in 5 games again to the Rockets. You didn't want to make it 1 round in the playoffs fewer than last year. By that measure, it's a failure. But you look at the core here. Donovan Mitchell was not good the first couple months of the season. Second half of the season, he was a hands down 100% all-star. I think he averaged like 27 points, 41% from 3. Like, he was the guy that I thought he was going to be going into the season. He became that player. He had a slow start last year, too. My sense is Donovan Mitchell this offseason is going to focus in a way he may not have this past offseason when he's kind of overwhelmed by all the attention and all the responsibilities of being an NBA star. And my guess, and this is just my guess is that kind of slowed him at the beginning, and that he's going to put in so much time in the gym because that guy's such a hard worker. And he's going to come out as an all-star next year. That is huge. Like, that is the type of player that teams tank for. He's a franchise player, and then you have a defensive franchise player in Rudy Gobert. That cap space is a really big thing. This team, like, when you look at their season, yeah, they won a couple more games than last year. But, like, not to get too heavy into the numbers, but their net rating was one of the best in the NBA. Like, they should have won 57 or 58 games. And most people in the analytics world chalk that up to bad luck. They were the unluckiest team in the NBA this season, that they outscored their opponents at a much better rate than their win-loss record would have shown it. So if you're at 57 wins, you're what? 2 seed, 3 seed? Don't have to face the Rockets in the first round? Like, things are completely different. And the other part here, Donovan Mitchell makes that shot in Game 3. And I know he's just killing himself for it. But if he makes that shot, that series is tied at 2. And who knows what happens from there. Rockets still probably win. They're probably the better team. It's not like James Harden has been some stud late in the playoffs. So as much as you look at this season and kind of, as a Jazz fan, kind of feeling probably let down, I think you got to look at there's so many bright spots. They got to add another creator. I know Grayson Allen could at least shoulder some of that. Maybe Dante Exum will be healthy. I don't know how much you can count on that. I'm not sure how much of a true creator he really is anyway. I'd love to see this team land a big free agent. It feels unlikely, like unless you – and I live in a small market. I live in Minneapolis. And unless you have a connection to a player beforehand that's from there, like the place for some reason, or unless you draft them, it's hard to get a guy to be a free agent to come to your place. Mike Conley would be a great fit. Like, if they can pull off that trade for Mike Conley, I think that would be absolutely awesome. That could have been the trade, if it was made at this trade deadline, that could have vaulted the Jazz into that next tier, that tier right below the Warriors. So clearly there is stuff that they need to accomplish this offseason. Pretty big stuff, namely getting a shooter and a creator, or a couple. But you got to look at the foundation there and the culture, the winning culture. I can't tell you how important that is. The fact that they have a dude in Dennis Lindsey and a guy in Quinn Snyder and a whole team around them where there's continuity and they're all on the same page, that matters to NBA players. That matters to free agents. Yeah, it matters to be in LA and New York and all that stuff. But it also matters to be in a winning culture. And I think the Jazz have that. And that's something that is, speaking from a guy who lives in the city that has the Minnesota Timberwolves, it's such a rare thing, and you got to embrace that.
Well, there may have been some feathers ruffled when Ricky Rubio's name cropped up originally in this Mike Conley deal in the heart of this past season. The Jazz clearly had their eyes on improving their roster. And you mentioned Mike Conley, and Jazz fans want Kemba Walker as well. They want Malcolm Brogdon. They want a bunch of different options in there. But, you know, there's also this option for Ricky Rubio to come back. And the Jazz and Rubio were kind of nebulous as to whether or not they both wanted that, but it's clearly an option. What we're trying to figure out, though, is what's the market for Ricky Rubio? Let's say Rubio wants out. How many different teams, and what's the market value you think for Rubio this offseason?
He's a mediocre starting point guard in the NBA. Like, that's worth something, but is he going to make more than $10 million a year? I don't think so. Like, Ricky Rubio is a really nice player. But I think he has a pretty distinct ceiling because, I mean, look, the airball 3 that he hit, what game was that? It was a Game 5.
Game 5,
yeah. That to me just said a lot about Ricky Rubio. It's like he's there. He plays the game the right way, whatever that means. He's a winner on defense. He tries hard. He's in the right spot to get that pass with a big shot that could have, won that game, and he airballs it. And that ultimately is probably what's going to make the Jazz fall short. If you have Ricky Rubio on your roster, you got a point guard who can't really make threes consistently. And you see it in his body language sometimes. When he's off from 3, he knows it's not going in. And he just doesn't have a shooter's mentality. I think he's a fine player. And people love him, right? Like, he's a good locker room guy. Do you want that as your starting point guard for a team that has aspirations to go deep in the playoffs? I don't think so. I think you got to aim higher than Ricky Rubio. And look, I get that it ain't going to be easy. Mike Conley ain't going to be easy to get. Kemba Walker is going to be a tough sell, especially if the Knicks are in the mix. I'm trying to think of other free agent point guards, but like, you need someone else next to Donovan Mitchell, and I don't think Ricky Rubio is that guy.
Reed, the draft's coming up a little less than 2 months. Teams are going to start doing their workouts. Jazz have the number 23 overall pick. I know this is a weak draft outside of really maybe the top 1, maybe top 2. Some may even say 5, but it starts to fall off. And then maybe there's some talent at the end of the first half of the first round. What have you seen in this draft? What's going to be available around the 20s?
Yeah, so me, there's a top 3 for sure list where these guys all have chances to be superstars. You know who these guys are. It's Zion Williamson, John Morant, and R.J. Barrett. Probably in that order. Maybe R.J. Barrett goes 2 and John Morant goes 3. After that, there's still some nice players in the top 10. I don't think there are those guarantee superstars. I think it's either you're getting a guy who could be an elite role player, someone like DeAndre Hunter from Virginia, who I think is really, really good, or you're taking a swing at a guy who could be awesome. Cam Reddish, he could be Paul George. Darius Garland could be this awesome, small, high-scoring point guard. But I think there's a lot of variance with guys like that. Less variance with someone like DeAndre Hunter, but DeAndre Hunter doesn't have that type of ceiling. Once you get into the 20s, things get a little tough, right? Like Tyler Hero from Kentucky, he's a hell of a shooter, but he's really young. Like, that's a guy who I think could be a nice fit for the Jazz. Will someone like Romeo Langford from Indiana, a guy who really frustrated Indiana fans, but he's clearly talented, is that a guy that you might be able to go for? I think that could be a compelling pick if he lasts that long. But really, when you get to that point in the draft, I don't think there are – I mean, look, if you get like a Grayson Allen type at that point, I think Grayson Allen's going to be a contributor in the NBA. And he could be the type of guy the Jazz are looking for when they and I wouldn't be surprised if it's as early as next year as he started to get some serious minutes. But I think that is the type of player that you'll probably see the Jazz go for around there.
Find him on Twitter at Reed4Gray. Read him at CBSSports.com. You can also catch him in GQ Magazine and New York Times Magazine. Great stuff, Reed. Thanks.
Thanks, Reed.
All right, thanks, guys.
There he is, Reed4Gray, giving us a good 20 minutes on the Utah Jazz and the NBA offseason.
GQ Magazine there. He's done it all. He's got the style. And the style of the NBA right now is one where your bigs shoot. And Derek Favors does not shoot. Rudy Gobert does not shoot. Joe Ingles, for whatever reason, he's a shooter, but he did not even attempt shots against Houston this year in the postseason. Rubio is not a good shooter. My math could be off here, but I think that's 4 guys that the Jazz start that aren't shooters. I reckon we need some shooting.
You could flip it. You could say Joe Ingles is a good shooter and Donovan Mitchell's not a great shooter. He will shoot, but he doesn't shoot the ball well.
Yeah, but sure, I'm not going to take anything away from Mitchell. Donovan Mitchell was sensational throughout the entire postseason and throughout his entire career. Joe Ingles was a no-show in the postseason. So I'm not going to put him in the category of being a shooter. He was taking 6 shots a game against Houston. It was frustrating.
Poorly.
And then on top of that, didn't make any of them. But he only shot 5 or 6 times. So the Jazz had 4 non-shooters on the floor at once. And, spoiler alert, it didn't work. So you need to add shooting. And not 60-year-old men like Kyle Korver. Bless his heart, he's a dead-eye shooter. But he's just not functional enough defensively overall right now to give you what the Jazz need. No, the Jazz need more guys with just a basic sense of how to shoot the ball. Rubio does not have that. What about Malcolm Brogdon? I mean, or at least, how about as far as a replacement for Derek Favors? Does Mirotic come in, Nikola Mirotic come in and solve that either?
Absolutely. Would help as a shooter, would help spread the floor. And that is the one thing that maybe Dennis Lindsey was most locked in on what the Jazz need this offseason. He said snipers at any position. We need guys who can come in because he looked at Kyle Korver and how well Korver did. I don't know if Kyle Korver's still in the NBA next season. He might decide to hang it up and take the $4 million the Jazz would owe him. And good for Kyle Korver if he does that. But the Jazz could then find that money to go elsewhere. But yeah, the Jazz need to find more shooting. They need more scorers to help some of those guys who can just get hot. And they just did not have enough of those guys this season. Go check out Everest Collision Repair. If you've been in a car accident, they'll get you back on the road as quickly as possible. With the best collision repair professionals in the state of Utah, Everest Collision Repair, State Street between 13th South and 17th South. They'll get you in a rental car and get you back on the road as quickly as possible. Everest Collision Repair. When we come back, let's talk about the Utes' 2019 college football season. It's Gunther and Ben, Utah's #1 sports talk, ESPN 700. Gunther and Ben, ESPN 700, 232. Kyle Gunther, Ben Anderson. With the way Utah ended their regular season, or I guess the season in 2018, they got crushed by... Well, they didn't get crushed by Washington, but certainly they were not able to put up much offense against Washington, and then they really got crushed in the third quarter against Northwestern.
They got their spirit crushed against Washington because it was the second time facing that team in the same season, and it was a very similar result. Utah's offense with different quarterbacks struggled to move the ball, and Utah's defense was sensational throughout almost the entirety of that game, but Washington was clearly the better team. And then the meltdown in the bowl game is a painful realization as to why you need a quality backup. because a guy like Jason Shelley made a bunch of really nice plays for the Utes. And especially in the first half against Northwestern in the Holiday Bowl, he was efficient. He was avoiding the big mistake. He made 3 mistakes in the third quarter that flipped the entire game on its head.
Well, those 3 were interceptions. That's the problem.
The mistakes that you make when you're a young player can be catastrophic. For the most part, when a guy like Tyler Huntley at this point in his career, when he makes a mistake, he's not going to fumble then on top of it. If he gets sacked, he's not going to cough up the ball. Or if he sees somebody open at the last minute, he's not going to fire one in there. He's going to throw it out of bounds, more likely now.
And look, Tom Brady throws interceptions in the Super Bowl. It's about not compounding your mistakes. And that was the problem with what Jason Shelley did, was he made his first mistake, and where Tyler Huntley makes the mistake against USC or whoever it is, Stanford, he then bounces back and he makes 5 really good drives in a row, and you score on 3 of them, and all of a sudden it's 21-7 or 21-14, and you've more than made up for that mistake. It felt like the Utes were grinding to a halt coming out of last year, even though they won the South. And then you got a great positive when Zach Moss, Julian Blackman, Bradley and I, Lecky Fotu all announced they were going to come back to Utah. Then I thought Utah had a really good recruiting class. Not the best they've ever had, but certainly very nice. Getting Jordan Wilmore on that last day was a very nice plus for Utah. You went out and you got the Texas transfer at quarterback, Cam Rising, to come in. Then you had a really good spring, and then you had a really good draft. And I think those were all a little bit surprising. And I feel like Kyle Whittingham, and something coaches can do in an offseason, he can't control necessarily who gets drafted the month leading up to the draft, but you do it through 3 and 4 years working with these kids. I feel like Kyle Whittingham has thrown a bunch of gasoline back into this truck that had slowed down at the end of the regular season.
And I think everyone who watched those final 2 games could naturally feel that same way. However, let's talk about something you're not supposed to do in football, the coulda, woulda, shoulda game. You make a couple of different plays, and you grind out a game against Northwestern that you were in the lead against. You were running the football. You were up 20-3. You had some momentum. If you avoid the big mistake, and that's a big if, imagine what we would feel like today. Had the Utes, let's say they did lose twice to Washington. Okay, bummer. It's their first time going to the Pac-12 championship game. They lost to the best team in the conference. But then after that, they turned it around in the Holiday Bowl. It was their first ever Holiday Bowl, and they beat a good team in Northwestern from the Big Ten. But that's not the storyline. The narrative is, as you mentioned, that the Utes were grinding to a halt at the end of the year. But then the draft would tell you a different story, that, hey, this team was trending up. This was a talented enough team to win. And as you mentioned, that was with Utah's top 4 guys coming back to school. The Utes have 8 draft picks on this team right now, heading into the 2019 season in the fall. This is another very talented Utah team. But I get your point about the lack of momentum it felt like the Utes had in January. But think about it. If you beat Northwestern with your backup quarterback, that will be the fourth quality win for Jason Shelley, because he would have beaten, he came back against BYU.
Beat
Oregon with Justin Herbert. Beat a bad Colorado team, but he beat that team in a blizzard.
On the road.
Which is tough to do, and he was good in the red zone there. And then, lose to Washington, okay, great, but then somehow, found a way to Trent Dilfer yourself a victory against Northwestern. But again, that's a big if. Because the backup quarterback situation wasn't good enough last year, Utah fell short of its goals. Utah's got to have a better backup quarterback situation this year, and there's still been no word on Cam Rising as to whether or not he's eligible in 2019.
Doesn't seem promising. Like, it seems like the NCAA would maybe try and expedite that process if they thought you were going to get this guy. Like, they would they will do a primary look through some of these resumes of kids who are going to be approved. And they say, well, yeah, this kid's going to be in, and we're going to allow him to go and play right away, because that way Indiana knows they're going to have Jack Tuttle, and they can work with Jack Tuttle. It does seem like they're dragging their feet with Cam Rising, and maybe he got initially put to the discard pile, and they said, let's re-examine it when we have a little bit more time this summer.
Well, here's a great observation.
And it's been really frustrating to see a number of kids who have hired attorneys have success against the idiots and the criminals at the NCAA. But how about the kids who can't afford to hire an attorney and that have filled out the paperwork appropriately and are getting the business from the NCAA, or the NCAA is denying them, or they're just putting it off? Because obviously if you hire a high-priced lawyer who can go through and read the documents and realize Johnny Cochran can come in and tell you, if the dorm doesn't fit, you must acquit. The dorm wasn't to your liking. Somebody peed down the street and you're allergic to human urine, whatever it is, you had to get out of there. It had nothing to do with the football team.
That'd be a tough allergy.
Well, what do you do when you get stung by a jellyfish? If you're allergic to urine, you can't have anybody else pee on it. You can't pee on it.
Issue. That wouldn't be my primary problem.
Well, that's what they say. And that is true, that if you do get stung by a jellyfish, you got to pee on it.
You know what, another thing I missed?
Not that you don't pee on the jellyfish. You pee on the wound from the jellyfish.
Just do whatever you have to do. Another thing I missed is that the Utes upgraded their offensive coordinator this offseason. And that was not something I thought the Utes had been doing. I thought the Utes had kind of been going in the opposite direction as far as name value of their hires. And that's not to, kick Troy Taylor on his way out the door. He did fine. He won the South for Utah. He did some nice recruiting for the Utes. He got big names to come in. But going out and getting a guy like Andy Ludwig is inarguably a bigger hire than when you went out and added Troy Taylor. Troy Taylor was a offensive coordinator for an FCS school. You went out and got an offensive coordinator from an SEC school to come in and coach for you now, who's going to come in and have success, and it's been all over the place.
There was a write-up, I believe, in the Des News recently, a bunch of the quarterbacks, Jason Shelley and Tyler Huntley, and even Cam Rising and Drew Lisk were talking about how well they all get along, and they're bros, and they're ha-ha-ha, and they hang out and whatever. But what they said was that there's a pretty distinct difference now with Andy Ludwig, that when they said when he walks into the building, you know that he is all business, and they are all business now in the meeting room, and then they have a fun relationship outside of that meeting room, which also makes you appreciate your friends and your teammates more. When you've really got to lock in for 45 minutes, there's no grab ass.
Yeah.
There's no CFA time, as Andy Ludwig likes to say.
I'm not going to Utah.
That's Charlie mess around time.
Yeah.
But and they didn't necessarily say this to disparage Troy Taylor, but we've met Troy. He's a nice guy. In fact, that might be the issue, is that he's too nice, and that you got to have a little bit of lead in your pencil there. You got to have some weight behind your words. And if the players don't respect you, then they may start to question what you're doing, and that is a recipe for a disaster.
And that's not to say there aren't nice guys and good coaches, and the players coach on Utah's roster, it's loaded with them. They've got a bunch of former NFL players. They've got a bunch of young coaches who you can go to and talk to. But yeah, sometimes the head guys probably need to rule with a hammer a little bit.
Not everybody can be Freddie Kitchens. The new Browns head coach is genuine. He was a great football player and apparently a college baseball player too. But that ability for him to be nice, as it were, it works now at this time of year. But in October, when your team needs answers or guys are going to quit on the season, that's when those issues start to become public.
Hugh Jackson seemed like a really nice guy.
He won a game in 2 years.
He seemed like a nice guy.
No, it's not that you can't be a nice guy. It's that you have to have a persona in front of the team that is nails. And the moment you open it up, you have a little bit of a laugh.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, then you get this moniker of being a player's coach, like Gary Anderson or like Kalani Sitake. How many other player coaches, that style can you name? Because they just don't come around that often. So when we hear about a guy like Kalani Sitake, who's incredibly unique, he is not a pushover. When we talk about him being a fun coach or a player's coach, you're talking about 5% of the time. The rest of the 90% of the time, he's an ass kicker.
Just like me.
You've got about 2% ass kicker in you, and boy, I tell you, you're about 98% chewed bubblegum. You're just like...
but that's hard. Chewed bubblegum usually is pretty hard. It's like been stuck somewhere for a while.
No, chewed bubblegum. I mean, it's the one that's in your mouth.
Oh, not
soft.
The one that's stuck under a desk. That's been there for a couple of years.
That's hardened bubblegum, and of course that's hard. I wouldn't have said hardened bubblegum. I said chewed bubblegum because that is a phrase that I've heard for years from coaches. Gunther, your ass looks like chewed bubblegum. And I said, Coach, stop looking at my ass.
When
Weirdo.
we come back, a big
Stop looking at my
name
cheeks.
potentially ready to recruit Urban Meyer to USC. We'll tell you who that is coming up next. Gunther and Ben, Utah's #1 sports talk, ESPN 700. Gunther and Ben, ESPN 700. Kyle Gunther, Ben Anderson, 250.
I've known you for many years, Ben, and today you told us something that I never thought I would ever hear you say. For people who do not know you, you look like a fine young man, but a physically active person you are not. You have always had an aversion to movement.
Sure.
I've heard before that you have paid people to check your mail for you.
Go get it.
You don't even like checking your own mail.
It's inside. I've got a mail slot. I just want them to go to the front door.
I have always been envious of your diet choices, which are just a lot of chocolate milk and red straws.
Pretty easy.
So you show up today and you got veggies and hummus with you. You have hummus, and I've never seen that combination before. I didn't think much of it. I thought, okay, kudos to you. Then you said you went for a run today.
It's getting warm out finally.
Is this your first run since, probably since George Bush Jr. was in office?
Senior. Since the early 90s.
Whoa!
Yeah, 91.
You decided today of all days, Tuesday, April 30th, I'm going to go for a jog.
A cloudy, gray day, too.
Which is a good day. I didn't want it to be too hot. I wanted to go out for a quick jaunt.
So it's your first movement in nearly 2 decades. Do you limp right out of the gates, or does your body even move anymore?
It takes a while to get the machine started. Once it gets running, it goes for, quarter mile. It runs at a high speed, and then it breaks down immediately.
Do you actually, when you run, do you pick your feet up off the ground, or are they kind of shuffling?
Just kicking. It's
okay.
Where I run, they've got like a wood chip track. So there's just wood chips everywhere.
When you run, how much space is between the back of your heels and your buttock? Because I imagine it's about a mile.
Just like when I'm standing.
Yeah.
Exact same amount as when I'm standing.
Yeah, what's the form that you're working with?
USC coach Clay Helton will start the 2019 campaign under immense pressure, according to CBSSports.com. And then we know that their first 6 games are absolutely brutal. What do they go? Fresno, at BYU.
Yeah, Notre Dame, Utah.
They get 2 preseason or 2 non-conference games. Then they go home against Utah. They go at Washington, and they have Notre Dame. And I think they have Stanford mixed in as well. They go at Notre Dame. Their start to their season is absolutely brutal through 6 games, and I don't think anyone's going to be surprised if Clay Helton doesn't emerge. Reggie Bush, the former Heisman Trophy winner, told the Los Angeles Times that if that happens, he will be ready to go out and recruit Urban Meyer to come in and be the next head coach at USC.
Matt Leinart has reportedly been doing the same thing, and once this story gets out there, this is how you originally grease the wheel. This is how you start the process. Maybe Reggie Bush came up with this on his own. Maybe Urban Meyer's talked to him. Maybe not. Either way, you start putting this out there. And it's the worst kept secret in all of sports. Everyone said the same thing when he stepped down at Ohio State. I don't know what you call what happened there. He didn't do a good job monitoring his coaches there, and he let some really bad stuff go on. But nobody believed Urban when he said he was retired, and USC was a job that made a lot of sense for him.
USC starts the season Fresno, Stanford, at BYU, home against Utah, at Washington, at Notre Dame. That's about as brutal to start as you could draw up for anyone in the season.
There's just no way that, even though USC is that talented, there's no way that team makes it out 4-2 even at that
not
point.
Even close, no.
You're going to be sitting at best 500 and...
What is this? We
Is
starting
this
up the
timber?
hot seat? Or what are we doing? Starting up the hot seat?
Oh, I thought there was a tree falling down.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Is there a hot seat? What is that?
Yeah, it was at a hot plate?
That was the engine getting started.
Okay, for the hot seat.
Oh, okay.
Or was that for my body to start my jog?
Both.
Well, I mean, your body can't get that hot there. There's just no way that Clay Helton's going to make it through. And obviously, if Urban Meyer is waiting in the wings, which he is a free agent, USC has the ability to go after a guy like that.
And I think you're right. Remember the issue why they couldn't fire Clay Helton in the offseason? They didn't have enough money. They've got this huge lawsuit going on campus right now.
Clay Helton's buyout was close to $20 million.
So how do you start to get the boosters back involved? Well, put a huge star out in front of them. Boosters, the diehards, love the old players. They always are going to love the old players, and USC's old players are a different caliber than Utah's old players. Now, look,
they're Hall of Famers.
Boosters are excited when Alex Smith comes back, or whoever you want to throw out there. Eric Weddle comes back, and
or
it's
myself
good.
Or Eric Weddle,
yeah,
sure,
I mean, sure, something like that. It helps. When Reggie Bush starts talking about this, and the boosters can kind of get excited for it, and he shows up at some boosters meetings and talks a little bit about donating money, and he's going to throw in a little bit of money too. I'll put in $100,000 towards it. Whatever Reggie Bush has to say to really get other people to throw in a bunch of money, that is how you get this process started, and I think that's why you're starting to see it.
Reggie says, you know what, guys? I'll throw my financial hat in the ring here, too. I'll give you guys a house near USC's campus that you guys gave to me about 15 years ago. So I'll put that in the mix for Urban Meyer, and there's no doubt that Urban would have success at USC. There is doubt as to how long it could last, but maybe Urban is that spark you need to get the program back on track, because there's always been talent, there will be talent, and there is talent there, but that team does not respect Clay Helton. There's no way that you could show me the way they closed that 2019 season. There's no way you could point to that group and say they respect Clay Helton. They thought he was going to be gone this offseason, and they probably were right. USC lost 5 of their last 6 to close the season. The only game they accidentally won was against an awful Oregon State team. That is a team that's sending the message to move on from Clay Helton, and USC did not. So they're going to have to make a move next year.
And unless you're a radio host, former players talking about the current coach and maybe wanting to replace him is not a great look. And it's happened at BYU most recently with Ty Detmer when some former BYU players came out and were saying, hey, maybe we need to move on from this. Once the former players can say it, which kind of crosses – I don't want to say crosses a line that they can't cross. They can say whatever they want to. It crosses a line that's hard to come back from for the school itself. When the stars start talking about, hey, maybe we should replace this guy, some of the legends in history, and we saw that some of the BYU greats were talking about how Ty Detmer wasn't doing a good enough job, it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube, and you're certainly seeing it at USC now.
Well, I know that Andy Ludwig has the respect of all of Utah's players who played for him because he was a great coach, and I think it's the right move to bring him back. I know Kyle Whittingham is universally beloved, and the future is always going to be one that has some questions ahead of it. But I mean, has Utah ever been in a better spot? And we're talking about USC here and how they're going to move on from. Is that their third mistake they've made? I mean, Kiffin and Sark and the disaster that Sark was, and now Clay Helton.
And don't forget Lynn Swan. Lynn Swan's been awful as an athletic director. They made a bunch of mistakes now. So
a school like Utah stands to really benefit from this, where the guys, USC is going to get the top 3 or 4. But what about players 5 through 6 in California that normally would have gone to USC or UCLA? They now say, yeah, maybe we will go to the best team in the South, which is Utah. It's an hour and 15-minute flight. And all of a sudden, Utah is easily beating USC 2 out of every 3 years. That could also be the case in the near future.
Coming up in the 3 o'clock hour, we'll keep talking about Utah's 2019 college football season, some of the teams that can compete with them in the South, and we'll talk a little bit more about the NBA playoffs last night and the big games tonight. Gunther and Ben, Utah's #1 sports talk, ESPN 700.